There is a moment in a man's life when everything he built suddenly stops feeling solid. A house becomes just a building. A marriage becomes paperwork. A future becomes a blank page. It often happens after 40, sometimes after 50, when the world expects you to have everything figured out. Instead, you wake up in the middle of your life and realize you're standing inside a structure that doesn't belong to you anymore. You spent decades trying to be steady, reliable, useful, because that's what men do. Meanwhile, the person you trusted slowly drifted into a different universe without telling you. You kept walking toward her. She kept walking away. That distance over years becomes a canyon, and by the time you notice, she's already somewhere you can't reach. That's how grey divorce begins. Silently, slowly, like a crack in the wall that no one bothered to fix. The cruel part about this stage of life is that the break rarely comes from nowhere. Deep down, you saw the signs long before everything collapsed. You saw her eyes turning colder. You felt her affection shrinking drop by drop. You felt the weight of her resentment even when she said everything was fine. That word, fine, bleeds a marriage to death. But as a man, you convinced yourself it was just stress, hormones, a phase. You told yourself that being patient and loyal would eventually bring her back. What you didn't know is that some women don't come back. Some women emotionally check out years before they physically leave. They test how many parts of you they can remove without you collapsing, and when they realize you're strong enough to endure it, they feel nothing. Not gratitude, not relief, just boredom. That boredom becomes a noose around your life. A man can spend 20 years trying to become the rock she leans on. Then, when she realizes she can stand perfectly upright without you, she doesn't see strength, she sees disposability. That's the poison men discover too late. You believe stability was love. She believed stability was the bare minimum. While you were investing in the life you were building, she was measuring how much more she could get without giving anything back. You worked, you provided, you sacrificed your dreams because that's what a grown man does when he chooses commitment. She instead slowly rewrote the story in her head. She became the victim. You became the burden, and every problem, real or imagined, became your fault. By the time she stands in front of you saying, "I just don't feel the same," she has already emotionally replaced you months earlier. When grey divorce hits, it doesn't just end a marriage, it ends the man you used to be. You suddenly confront a truth that stabs deeper than betrayal. She didn't leave because you failed. She left because she changed. Or rather, she allowed herself to drift into the easiest escape, reinvention without responsibility. Women in midlife crave a story where they get to restart without the weight of their past choices. So they convince themselves that the life you built together is a cage, and the first person they blame for that cage is you. You become the symbol of every regret she never processed. You become the face of every dream she didn't chase. You become the reason she feels old, tired, unseen. She forgets the years you held everything together when she couldn't. She forgets the nights you carried the weight of both your lives. She forgets that the very stability she resents now was the same stability she begged for in the beginning. This is where you enter the story. Because if you're listening to this, there's a part of you that recognizes the terrain. There's a part of you that lived that cold detachment, that empty silence at dinner, that feeling of being punished just for trying. You remember the moment she stopped touching you, not physically, but emotionally, like you were still in the room but irrelevant. A man doesn't break when a woman leaves. He breaks when she stays but withdraws her soul. That is the true divorce. The emotional one that happens years before legal documents enter the picture. You survived that part. You endured the slow freezing of someone who once warmed your entire world. That alone says more about your strength than anything she will ever admit. Yet the world will tell you that you failed. Society has a script. When a marriage ends, the man must be at fault. He must have been inattentive, distant, unromantic, or immature. Because the idea that a woman can simply stop loving her husband terrifies people. It destroys the myth of female loyalty. It reveals something many men learn too late. Love is not guaranteed, not even after decades. Love is not a contract. Love is a mood, and many women treat marriage as a vessel for their emotional weather. When their inner storms change direction, so does their commitment, and you're expected to accept this with grace, to lose your home, your money, your stability, sometimes even your children, while still being called the stable one. But here is the truth most men never hear. Grey divorce is not the end of you. It's the demolition of the life you built for others, so you can finally build something for yourself. You didn't lose a wife, you lost an illusion. You lost a person who would rather rewrite her personal narrative than face her own contradictions. You lost someone who used your reliability as a safety net, not as a foundation for partnership. That is a painful truth, but it's also liberating. Because a man who survives this kind of betrayal becomes something rare, someone who knows the cost of blind devotion and refuses to pay it again. The man who emerges from grey divorce is not the same man who entered it. He is quieter, sharper, more aware. He no longer chases validation, he seeks clarity. He no longer tries to save people who are determined to drown themselves. He no longer sacrifices himself to prove he's good enough for someone who already made up her mind. That version of you, the one you're stepping into now, has more depth, more power, more truth than any life you lived before. Because everything that tried to break you carved you instead. Everything she took from you revealed what was truly yours. The life ahead of you is not a consolation prize. It's the first time you get to live without pretending. When the dust settles after a grey divorce, the silence hits harder than the breakup itself. It's the silence of a home that suddenly feels too large. The silence of evenings that used to be filled with routine, even if that routine had grown cold. A man stands in that silence and finally hears something he ignored for years: himself. Not the version of himself that made compromises, not the one who tried to hold everything together, but the raw, unfiltered voice that was buried under responsibilities, expectations, and emotional exhaustion. That voice rarely speaks gently. It tells the truth. It tells you what you always knew but never admitted. You were living a life that demanded your strength but never returned your devotion. And now that it's over, you're finally free to examine the wreckage without being gaslit into thinking it's your fault. People assume that men recover quickly. They think all you need is a distraction, a new routine, maybe a fling to get over it. They have no idea what it means to lose someone you built a world with. A man doesn't just lose a partner, he loses the continuity of his story. He loses the identity he shaped around protecting someone who no longer cares. He loses a version of himself that existed only in relation to her. That's why the pain is so brutal. It's not just grief for her, it's grief for the man you were while you loved her. And yet, as destructive as that feels, it's also a turning point, because the version of you that is left standing is the one capable of rebuilding from truth, not illusion. That's the real beginning. You notice something strange in the weeks after she leaves. The world looks different. Little things you tolerated for years suddenly feel outrageous. The constant criticism, the emotional swings, the way you had to manage her moods like a fragile ecosystem. The way you were praised only when you served her needs, not when you expressed your own. The way affection became a currency you had to earn, rather than a natural part of your relationship. With distance, it all becomes embarrassingly clear. You weren't loved, you were used, depended on, tolerated. And every time you tried to express your pain, You were told you were too sensitive, too distant, too demanding. You start seeing the manipulation like you're watching a movie you've already seen, but this time you finally understand the plot. This is the stage where most men crumble or wake up. Because in this moment of clarity, something powerful surfaces. Anger. Not the destructive kind, the clarifying kind. The kind that tells you, never again. The kind that reminds you that you gave everything you had and it still wasn't enough, because the void you were trying to fill was inside her, not inside the marriage. You couldn't save her from her resentment, her boredom, her constant need for validation. You couldn't compete with the fantasy version of life she carried in her head. That anger is not bitterness, it's self-respect resurfacing after years underwater. It's the beginning of your rebirth, and here's where you enter the story again. Because if you're listening, there's a part of you that recognizes this anger, not as hatred, but as release. You're not angry that she left. You're angry that you abandoned yourself for so long in the name of peace. You're angry that you tolerated disrespect after disrespect to avoid conflict. You're angry that you tried to fix what she kept breaking. And the most painful truth of all, you're angry that you knew something was wrong years before the divorce. But you stayed anyway. That guilt burdens men far more than heartbreak. But guilt can be transformed. It can become fuel. It can become the fire that reforges the man you always should have been. There comes a moment, usually months after the separation, where something shifts. You wake up and realize you're no longer afraid of being alone. In fact, solitude becomes a relief. You begin to understand how much energy you spent just trying to keep the peace, how many parts of yourself you silenced to avoid setting her off, how much of your ambition you buried to make the relationship work. You start noticing how good it feels to have control over your own schedule, your own plans, your own space. That's when the real healing begins, not when you get over her, but when you stop missing the man you were while loving her. That version of you wasn't weak, but he was blind. And now your eyes are open. The world won't understand this transformation. Friends, colleagues, even family members will tell you to move on, date again, get back out there. They don't understand that what you are rebuilding is not your dating life, it's your soul. They don't see the quiet war happening inside you. The war between the man you were taught to be and the man you're becoming. The one who overgave, overprotected, overcommitted, and the one who will never do any of that again. There is a dignity being forged inside you now, a strength born from surviving something most people never even talk about. Grey divorce is a death, but it's also a birth. As you rebuild, you begin to notice a truth that was invisible before. You were never meant to be the caretaker of someone else's emotional storms. You were never meant to sacrifice your identity to keep a flawed marriage alive. You were never meant to carry both roles, provider and emotional sponge, just because she couldn't regulate herself. You start realizing that the life ahead of you can be cleaner, simpler, calmer. There's a clarity that only comes after losing everything you thought was permanent. And that clarity whispers something that feels almost dangerous to admit. You deserved better. Not a perfect relationship, not a perfect woman. Just someone who didn't treat your devotion like a resource to exploit. And the deeper you go into this new phase, the more you understand a harsh truth. Most men don't get to rebuild themselves until life tears them apart. You weren't given a choice, but you were given an opportunity. One you couldn't have found any other way. Now your days are no longer built around managing someone else's dissatisfaction. You're not walking on eggshells. You're not sacrificing your own needs just to avoid being criticized. You're no longer trapped in a dynamic where your worth depends on her mood. You finally have the freedom to ask the question you avoided for years. What kind of man do I want to be when no one is asking me to shrink? You survived the implosion. You endured the silence. You faced the guilt, the anger, the confusion, and you're still here. That means something. It means the second half of your life doesn't have to mirror the first. It means you get to rebuild with intention, with clarity, with standards so high that the man you used to be would barely recognize them. And it means that everything that once felt like a loss is now the foundation of something far stronger. A version of you that cannot be broken the same way twice. There's a moment after a grey divorce when a man's vision sharpens in a way that feels almost brutal. You start looking at relationships, not just yours but all of them, with a clarity you never had before. And that clarity isn't philosophical, it's primal. You begin to understand the female nature not from books or theories, but from lived experience, from the wound that split your life in two. People say heartbreak makes men bitter. That's not true. What heartbreak does is remove the filters. It strips away the romantic illusions that society forces on you from childhood. The fairy tale, the soulmate myth, the belief that loyalty is symmetrical. You see women not as angels or saviors, but as human beings with their own flaws, desires, fears, and contradictions. And many of those contradictions are exactly what tore your life apart. The man recovering from a grey divorce starts noticing patterns he ignored for decades. He sees how many women confuse happiness with excitement, how easily they mistake boredom for oppression, how often they blame their partners for problems they never had the courage to face in themselves. You begin to understand why so many marriages collapse after 50, because the woman who once depended on you now feels entitled to reinvention. She looks at the years you gave her, and instead of gratitude, she feels trapped, resentful, unfinished. That resentment grows quietly, like mold behind a wall, until one day she tears the house down and tells everyone you caused the structural damage. By the time you realize what's happening, she's already rewriting the story to make herself the protagonist and you the cautionary tale. And here's the truth that hits hardest. A man doesn't fully understand the emotional world of women until he has lived through their exit. You don't understand how rapidly their feelings can shift until they shift away from you. You don't understand how deeply they need to be in love to justify staying. You don't understand how easily they can detach when the spark fades, and you certainly don't understand how society will cheer for them, even when they destroy a life you sacrificed everything to build. That revelation is not misogyny. It's adulthood. It's the recognition that love, as most people describe it, is not a promise. It's a phase. And for many women, especially in midlife, that phase has an expiration date they won't admit until the moment they walk away. This is where you enter the narrative again, because if you've made it this far, you've already felt that sting. You've already seen how quickly affection can turn into criticism, how admiration can turn into resentment, how dependence can turn into disgust. You've seen the way she looked at you in the beginning, like you were the center of her world, and you've seen the way she looked at you at the end, like you were a reminder of everything she wanted to escape. That whiplash leaves a scar. But scars are not weaknesses. Scars are reminders. Never confuse devotion with safety. Never assume that giving more will secure anything. Never believe that love protects men. It protects women. Men are expected to bleed. Women are expected to evolve. Once that truth sinks in, something shifts inside you. You stop trying to understand why she changed and start understanding why you didn't. You stayed loyal out of duty. She stayed loyal out of emotion. Duty is stable. Emotion is volatile. You built your identity on commitment. She built hers on feeling. When the feeling died, the marriage died. That's the unspoken rule most men learn only after the papers are signed. And from that moment on, you stop idealizing women. You stop pretending they operate by the same code you do. You stop expecting them to honor the sacrifices you made. And strangely, that's when you start respecting yourself again. Because nothing is more humiliating for a man than holding on to someone who let go long before you did. But something else emerges in this stage, something far more powerful than cynicism. You begin to rebuild your standards, not the superficial ones you had in your 20s, but the deep existential standards forged by loss. You no longer tolerate disrespect disguised as independence. You no longer accept emotional inconsistency as passion. You no longer allow someone to weaponize intimacy to control you. The man who has survived a grey divorce becomes ruthlessly selective, not bitter, selective. He knows the cost of choosing wrong. He knows the cost of loving blindly. He knows the cost of losing himself inside a relationship that demands everything but gives nothing back, and he refuses to pay that cost again. And while the world might look at you and think you're hardened or closed off, the truth is the opposite. You're more open than ever to reality, to truth, to clarity. You no longer chase fantasies. You no longer build castles in the sand. You no longer confuse someone's potential with their character. Every interaction, every date, every new connection becomes a mirror that reflects what you learned through pain, that your peace is priceless, that your time is finite, that your worth is not measured by how much you endure. A man in midlife who has survived heartbreak does not love less. He loves smarter. He loves with boundaries. He loves with self-respect. And he never, ever sacrifices himself for someone who shows even a hint of the patterns he escaped. This newfound clarity does something else too. It changes the way you see yourself. For years, you were the good husband, the reliable one, the provider, the emotional stabilizer. But now you're something different. You're a man who has walked through fire and didn't come out bitter, just awakened. You finally see your strength not in how much you can carry, but in how much you refuse to carry anymore. You understand that love without reciprocity is slavery. You understand that peace without authenticity is rot. And you understand that nothing, absolutely nothing, is worth losing yourself again. As this transformation deepens, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel grateful for the breakup, not in a cliché, everything happens for a reason way, but in a visceral, undeniable way. Because without that breakup, you would have lived the rest of your life asleep. You would have continued shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. You would have continued justifying disrespect, blaming yourself for problems you didn't cause, trying to fix emotional wounds that were never yours to heal. The divorce didn't destroy your life. It exposed the truth. You were living a life that demanded your silence. And now that silence is gone, now your voice is back, now your future is finally yours. There comes a turning point after a grey divorce when a man realizes he's no longer in recovery, he's in rebirth. The pain becomes a blueprint. The past becomes a warning. The silence becomes a teacher. You start understanding that the first half of your life wasn't a failure. It was preparation. Every compromise, every disappointment, every betrayal carved out the person you're becoming now. A man who has survived the collapse of a marriage after 40 or 50 is not weak. He is forged. He is sharpened. He is carved into someone who finally understands his worth, not because a woman validated it, but because she tried to destroy it and failed. That realization shifts everything. It's the moment you stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start seeing yourself as the architect of what comes next. People around you won't understand this transformation. They'll say you seem different, colder, more distant. But you know the truth. You're not distant. You're deliberate. You no longer waste energy on relationships that drain you. You no longer accept love that feels conditional. You no longer carry anyone who refuses to carry themselves. The man who rises after a grey divorce becomes profoundly selective about who he allows into his rebuilt life. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. because he knows how much of himself he lost trying to keep someone else from falling apart. He knows the cost of trying to be someone's hero when they never intended to be your partner, and he knows that peace is not something you negotiate, it's something you protect. This is where you step fully into the frame, because the version of you that survived the divorce is not the same man who entered it. You've walked through emotional fire. You've stood face to face with abandonment, confusion, guilt, shame, and rage, and you're still standing. That alone makes you more powerful than you realize. Now you begin to rebuild not out of desperation, but out of intention. You rebuild your habits, your routines, your friendships, your environment. You rediscover the parts of yourself you buried to keep the marriage alive. Your ambition, your curiosity, your masculinity, your independence. You begin doing the things you once gave up, the trips you postponed, the hobbies you forgot, the dreams you labelled selfish. The truth is they weren't selfish. They were the parts of you she never bothered to understand. And something remarkable happens when a man in midlife finally chooses himself. The world opens. You start noticing how little approval you actually need, how much easier it is to breathe when you're not responsible for someone else's emotional weather, how much more alive you feel when your choices aren't filtered through someone's insecurities. You discover a freedom that's not wild or reckless. It's calm, grounded, sovereign. You wake up early not because you're obligated, but because you have purpose. Again, you go to the gym not to escape the house, but to build a body that reflects your discipline. You work not to keep the peace at home, but to build a future that belongs entirely to you. This is the second life most men never experience. You earned it through pain. But liberty isn't the only thing you gain. You gain clarity. And with clarity comes a different kind of strength. The strength to remain alone if necessary. After a grey divorce, a man stops fearing solitude, because he's lived the worst kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being next to someone who doesn't see him anymore. Compared to that, real solitude feels peaceful, dignified, empowering. You no longer chase companionship just to fill space. You no longer need someone to validate your existence. If a new woman enters your life now, she enters a world built on your terms. She enters a space where your boundaries are non-negotiable. She enters a home where your peace is the top priority. And if she threatens that peace, she leaves. No hesitation, no rescue missions, no self-sacrifice. And this is the part of the journey most men never expect. Rebuilding yourself doesn't just change your relationship with women. It changes your relationship with life. You stop tolerating disrespect in any form. You stop wasting time on people who drain you. You stop making excuses for situations that don't align with who you are becoming. The man who has survived a grey divorce becomes allergic to bullshit. He sees through manipulation instantly. He refuses to play savior. He refuses to dim his strength. And he refuses to negotiate with anyone who tries to make him feel guilty for choosing himself. But beneath this hardened clarity lies something softer, deeper, more profound: gratitude. Gratitude not for the betrayal, but for the awakening it forced. Gratitude for the second chance at life. Gratitude for the lessons learned through suffering. You start recognizing that what broke you also freed you. You start understanding that losing her didn't ruin your life. It removed the illusion that you needed her to have one. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, you feel something you thought was gone forever. Hope. Not naive hope. Not romantic hope. But grounded, disciplined hope. The belief that the rest of your life can be built intentionally, powerfully, authentically. And as this awareness settles in, you come to the final realization. The divorce was not your ending. It was your initiation. It stripped away the roles you performed for others and left behind the man you were meant to become. A man who knows himself. a man who trusts himself, a man who's done apologizing for wanting peace, respect, and reciprocity. A man who has looked at the ruins of his past and decided they will not define him, they will elevate him. The second life begins not when she leaves, but when you stop trying to bring her back, and you, right now, are standing at the threshold of that life. You survived the storm, now you build the world, not for her, not for approval, not for validation, but for yourself, finally, entirely, unapologetically.